Okay. Background of the coming kingdom. So, Old Testament antecedents to the inauguration of the kingdom at the first coming of Christ. Inauguration, again, means the beginning, the kickstart. So, we just, in the last set of slides, we talked about big picture things that we need to have in our heads as we read the Old Testament. And those big picture things are connected to what we did yesterday. Connected to, again, Old Testament concepts that have either, lots of connections, lots of divine counsel touch points, or, just a couple, but they all have divine counsel touch points. I have here the text versus popular eschatology. Again, I don't want you to take that as a swipe at a particular view. The reason I put that subtitle there is, going back to the very first session, you need to be more focused on the text than any system. I don't care what system you sort of have or were raised in. That's incidental. I want you to think about what's in the text, because there are things to think about there. So Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and Revelation are all connected. I'm sure you know this. If you've spent any time studying prophecy, you know that there are connections between these three things. So Daniel 2, I'm going to start here with what I'll call the popular dispensational view. And this is, again, sort of the left behind view, of, to use more of the vernacular. But in Daniel 2, Daniel records this visionary dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and it has certain features. Again, this is the image, the great image. Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, stomach and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet and toes of iron and clay. And then we get this stone, which is also called a mountain. Isn't that interesting, a mountain? Filled the whole earth. Oh, isn't that interesting? It fills the whole earth. Not just a place the size of New Jersey. Not made with human hands. So we learn, right from the text, this is the easy part, that this is Babylon, because Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold. And the supposition is, in this view, that the succession here of kingdoms are Media-Persia comes next, then Greece, then Rome, and then the millennial kingdom of God. And that's usually, it's oversimplified, I know. But those who don't want to see, or I should say, I don't want to state it negatively, those who want to see the kingdom as only future will look at, they'll tie the millennial idea to this. Since there's a relationship here, that this kingdom is associated with this last kingdom, if you're going to say it's Rome, well, there's a lot of time between Rome and this millennial kingdom. This is why, catch this, this is why this kingdom needs to begin during the time of this one, right? If this one's Rome, and someone believes that this refers only to the future millennium, this is why people argue that, oh, well, Rome must be like restarted again. There must be a new Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. Okay, you catch that? There must be, Revelation must describe, an empire, a kingdom that arises from the ashes of the old Roman system. The only reason they do that is because they know this connection has to be maintained. But they only see the kingdom as distant future. It's a lot easier if you see the kingdom as beginning during the actual Roman Empire, okay, which would be the time of Jesus. It's just a lot simpler. But if you make that decision, and amillennialists will, then the other side, the dispensational side, is going to accuse the amillennialists. Oh, you guys deny a literal kingdom, and what about the 1,000 years in Revelation and all this kind of stuff? And so that becomes the battleground. What? The belief that there will be no 1,000-year literal kingdom on earth. Is no, millennium. So again, this is a battleground area. Now there is a mediating position that the kingdom begins at this time, and it keeps progressing, and eventually it'll, have some sort of consummation point, either on earth or it just, transitions into the eternal state. We'll use that term. Now, I'm going to show you two scholarly, views that are held by scholars, and they'll be a little bit different takes on this. One is the majority. If most academics, who are not either are believers who are not dispensationalists or unbelievers who don't, care about theology. Would be the view that the majority of either of those groups hold. Babylon, again, is the easy part. Media and Persia, these are divided. Instead of Media, Persia, we have two separate kingdoms. And a lot of people conclude that the fourth kingdom was Greece, post-Alexander, all the way up through that, because the Seleucid Empire becomes important. Now, the Seleucid Empire, remember when Alexander dies, his kingdom divides into 4 quadrants. One of them are the Seleucids, who control Syria and parts of Asia Minor, up to the north, okay, and then down the south, is Ptolemy in Egypt, and then the other two guys are sort of incidental, far less important, because the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are fighting all the time, and Judea is in the middle of that, so they're getting torn apart by either side, for lots of years. But this view would say that the last kingdom is Greece, and that means that the kingdom, not made with hands, begins when the Jews revolt. In other words, it reestablishes Jewish rule in Palestine during the time of Antiochus, because Antiochus IV, he's the guy who, in everybody's system, is the type for the Antichrist, the template. Anybody here who has not heard of Antiochus IV? Okay. Antiochus IV was a Seleucid king. He is the guy, he referred to himself as Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, that he believed he was an epiphany, he was divine. He considered himself to be a deity. This is the guy who makes life unbearable for the Jews. He outlaws the Sabbath. He outlaws circumcision upon penalty of death. If you observe the Sabbath, penalty of death. He goes into the temple, slays a pig on the altar, that kind of thing. And his actions cause a revolt. And out of that revolt, the Jews win their independence from him. So since his life, I'm a deity, and I'm changing the customs, times, and seasons, and I slay the pig on the altar, I desecrate the altar, which actually gets referred to as the abomination of desolation. He becomes sort of the poster boy for Antichrist. Now, he wasn't the Antichrist because, Jesus is going to come along 150 years later and say, they ask him, what's the sign of your coming again? And then he'll start talking about Daniel 9. So this guy isn't it, but again, he's like the poster boy for what we suspect would happen. And everybody looks at Antiochus that way. The Jews called him Antiochus Epimanes instead of Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the madman. So, so some people say that this event is sort of the counterpart to this. And what that would mean is that it shows that God's human kingdom, the Jews, is never going to be completely stamped out. They will always be there. They will always occupy the land. And they're just going to have to wait, again, for some consummation later. Okay, so the majority view would say that. Now, a minority view says this. Nebuchadnezzar, again, that's the easy part, because it's usually just Babylon in general, but Daniel specifically tells Nebuchadnezzar that you're the head of gold. The next ruler is the next ruler after Nebuchadnezzar, and the next ruler after him, and the next ruler after him. You'll notice that these are the 4 guys who are actually mentioned in Daniel. Okay? So some would say this is what's going on, and Cyrus represents the fourth kingdom, and it's during the reign of Cyrus that the Jews are sent back to the Holy Land to restart the kingdom of God in some form on earth again in the promised land. So this is the regathering. This is the point when the Jews are reoccupy the land. So this view would take this whole idea, again, of the enduring, the everlasting kingdom as God's human kingdom. Again, the Jews are not dying off. It's never ending. God brought them back to the land, and they ain't going to leave. Even during the Crusades, I mean, they're still there. It's just that they're occupied, kind of like during Rome or any of these other reigns. So I just showed you three views of this. Now, some issues related to these. In either scholarly view, a first century Jew believed that God's kingdom, specifically them, their race, would ultimately emerge victorious and overspread the earth in a literal kingdom. So no matter what view you take, when the Jews are brought back out of exile, at the least, that means that God has remembered his covenant to that extent. He did not exterminate us in Babylon. Now, the northern kingdom, they were pretty well kind of exterminated and dispersed, but even if you read who comes back, there are representatives of some of the northern tribes in that list. So, even them are going to have a presence back in the land. So God brings us back, and we're going to look at Daniel in this way. We're back, and we will never be driven out completely and exterminated. And that would be the meaning in this view of this idea of the kingdom of God is started again on earth. Why? Because the kingdom of God, again, appears in conjunction with the final kingdom of Daniel 2. So whatever you think the final kingdom was, that's when the kingdom is supposed to start. Now, regardless of what the disciples were thinking in any of these views, that's what the disciples expected. When they get a clue as to, Jesus being who he is, that's their expectation. Even after he dies and rises again, when they meet there in Acts chapter 1, what do they ask him? Right. At this time, are you going to restore this is just ingrained. This is the expectation. And, we'll get into Jesus' answer a little bit later. But this is what they're expecting. We were brought back to the land, and we got kicked around, but we're still in the land. We got kicked around some more, but we're still in the land. We're not in Babylon. We're not in exile. We're still in the land. We ain't going away. We are a continual, eternal, everlasting presence. We are the people of God. We represent God's rule on earth. We're still getting kicked around, but someday the King will show up, and now it's payback time. This is what they're thinking. The last thing they want to hear is when the king shows up, he says, oh, by the way, I'm going to die, and I'm going to be raised again, and so that's bad enough. So like when it happens, wow, he rose from the dead. He's back. He's here. The king is here. Now it's payback time. Not really. They just don't want to hear this. And again, they have to be convinced. You think that when I leave, the kingdom leaves with me. You have no idea. Okay, I'm going to send the Spirit, and you go huddle in that upper room there. You wait a little while and pray. Because there's a calendar here that needs to work. Okay? And you'll find out that the kingdom hasn't gone anywhere. The kingdom started when I showed up. I mean, it really, because we did things like kick the demons around and healing and raising the dead and all this kind of stuff. That's what the kingdom is like. That's what it's going to be. And now, I'm going to leave, the Spirit's going to come, because this is my plan. It's not your plan. It's my plan. This is, the Father and I had in mind from the beginning. And now, the Spirit's going to go with each of you everywhere. And your job is to overrun the earth. Don't stay here. I'm not content with Israel. I'm not content with this little plot of turf. Go ye therefore, teach all nations. The Great Commission, the whole idea. Don't stay here. Overspread the earth. But again, that's not what they're expecting to hear. It's not, when the Spirit comes, and all the things that surround Pentecost and everything that ensues beyond that point, then it's like, wow, the kingdom is here. We're the ones that are chosen to perpetuate this, and the Spirit goes with us. And he's even called the Spirit of Jesus several times, which is kind of interesting. Where two or three are gathered, I'm in your midst. All these sort of statements. Which view is best? Ultimately, I'd say, I don't think it matters a huge amount. I kind of like, certain things about certain, different aspects of the views. Kingdom in Daniel 2, you might want to turn to Daniel 2 just so you can follow some of the text. Kingdom in Daniel 2, 37 through 44, when Daniel is talking about these kingdoms, is Malku or Malkut. It's Aramaic. And it can either point to separate kingdoms, like, different ethnic kingdoms. You have Babylonian, you have, Media-Persia, or Media and Persia, or Greece and Rome. It can also refer to regimes, within one of those, which is the minority scholarly view. I think verses 43 and 44 tilt the argument in favor of the minority view. This is the one I prefer. And the minority view was this one, that in Daniel 2, now I don't look at Daniel 7 the same way, but this is what he has in mind, and then we get the return from exile. And here's why I think I kind of go that way. Because of these two verses, 43 and 44. As you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed. Now, if we want it to be really rigidly literal, the text says, mixing they will be with the seed of men. Another literalism would be, they themselves will mingle with the seed of men. Other translations have something like, they will mingle their human seed. That is, they will intermarry. The expression means populate. If you go to Jeremiah 31, 26 to 28, you have the same language in this passage, occurs in this passage, and it refers to populating. Now, if you're going to, let's just go to the next one. You see the language here, in the days of those kings. This is what sort of persuades me of the minority view. This phrase, in the days of those kings, meaning what? In relation to the time period when all this is happening, or during the successions of the fourth kingdom, during the dynastic period in which all the kings of Nebuchadnezzar were alive, you got to, in some way, have these kings, all four of them, in view, in the picture. Not just the last one. You got to have all four of them somehow in view. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. If you take the minority view where you have Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, and Cyrus, all four of those guys rule over the same territory. Okay? You don't have an ethnic, you don't have a change, a differentiation in kingdoms. It's all the same place. And it reads more like a dynastic succession. So that's why I kind of prefer the other one, because in the days of those kings, when it's still sort of one kingdom, one entity, then the Jews are allowed to return. I just think it fits this phrase better. But, it's not that big of a deal. So the fourth king in the minority view is Cyrus. Cyrus was part Median and part Persian. He married a Persian. Daniel 9 describes him as ruling over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. And the Chaldeans, again, is a broad term for all these ethnicities in the same region. Okay. So the implication is that the Medes and the Persians bring a new dynasty, but within the history of one empire. So this would be the mingling. And Cyrus was Yahweh's anointed. He is the Messiah. He's that Messiah, that deliverer. In Isaiah 45:1, he is mentioned by name and called Mashiach in that verse. Okay, he delivers Israel. He releases the Jews. The kingdom of God is reinstituted and survives and returns to Israel. But his own mingled kingdom fails. The verse does say it doesn't work. Now, I know that this verse is associated with this genetic hybrid thing. Again, I have the language colorized here. A couple notes. The passage doesn't predict anything farther out than the Roman Empire. So even if you don't take either the minority scholarly view or the majority scholarly view, you go back to the passage, the fourth kingdom is Rome. It's either Rome or Greece or Cyrus. There's nothing further out than Rome. So that alone should tell you that there might be a problem with thinking that the fourth kingdom is like today and we have genetic hybrids here. Okay, there's a significant disconnect in regard to that, at least that idea. The kingdom has to begin in the fourth kingdom. Jesus quotes Daniel 7 of the inauguration of the kingdom, which coincides with the council meeting on the fourth beast. So again, when you get to Daniel 7 has a relationship to Daniel 2, again, because we have a succession of four kingdoms again. Again, if you've spent any time in prophecy, this is not going to be new information for you. And it's during when the divine council meets in Daniel 7 and decrees that the fourth beast needs to die and it's put to death and all that stuff. In conjunction with that decision, that is when the Son of Man gets the kingdom. So again, there's a link here between the fourth kingdom and the inauguration of the kingdom of God. So you have all this going on at the fourth one. Biblical writers knew nothing of genetics. I think that's a significant point. Plus, if you want to look at genetic hybrid, the verse says it doesn't work. It fails. Whatever it is, it fails. You can't really get away from that. Just as iron does not mix with clay, they will not hold together.
Mike, can you go back, because when you went to the verses and you used your cursor and said, look, it fails, you were circling something and the guys on the web didn't see
Oh,
it.
okay.
So I want them to see.
All right. When it fails, okay, they will not hold together, and in the days, just as iron does not mix with clay. So when it says they do not hold together, I would say that means it doesn't hold together. All right. I mean, it's kind of obvious. So whatever it is, it doesn't work. It fails. It stops. It ceases. It dies. I mean, whatever you want to say, it doesn't work. And I think because we have these connections between the start of the kingdom and the fourth kingdom, the fourth beast, Daniel 2, Daniel 7, we need to find some way that the fourth kingdom has some sort of mingling, and the fourth kingdom launches the kingdom of God. All those things have to fit together to make sense of the passage. So I think to pick out one or two phrases of these, it is not a good method. Again, plus the language is used elsewhere for, populating an area in Jeremiah. Now, let's do some superimposition here. In the majority view, the majority scholarly view, again, either scholars who are not dispensational, or scholars who, combine with scholars who aren't theologically anything, this is where most of them are at. So you have your vision elements, your dream elements, and you have your kingdoms here. If the fourth kingdom is Greece, well then you have this Jewish revolt thing going on. To me, the return from exile just makes more sense. But anyway, this is their view, that this kingdom here is the Jewish independence. Then you go to Daniel 7, and you've got the four beasts right here. And it's during, again, the death of the fourth beast is going to trigger the kingdom of God, led by the Son of Man. The Son of Man is symbolic for human Jews in this view. Again, it's not necessarily my view, but in this view. The holy ones, Hasidim, take the kingdom from the Seleucids. Now, this is precisely what happened. When they revolt against Antiochus, when he desecrates the altar, when he plays the Antichrist role, and the Jews win their independence, a specific, the leadership there was called the Hasidim, okay, the faithful ones, the holy ones. And again, these terms are also used in the Bible. So they're the ones who sort of take control and take the kingdom. We have independence now, and so on and so forth. Revelation, the book of Revelation, applies this to the risen Christ and the impending, fourth beast during the Roman Empire. So again, you can take this view. I don't really care, really. Everybody's going to argue for their view. You're going to argue. You're going to defend it against its problems. You're going to have answers to what about this, what about that. I just want you to see how other people look at it and why. The minority view, again, has the four here as ending with Cyrus. Okay, Daniel 2 was about the kings up to Cyrus because it's a historical genre in Babylon. Again, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are recounting history. The last, 7 to 12 is apocalyptic and eschatology. The exception, of course, is chapter 2. So parts of chapter 2 are repurposed in chapter 7. So this view would say, when you get to Daniel 7 to 12, it's elaborating on the prophecy in chapter 2, and that's where you get the succession of kings. So this view would say Daniel 7 through 12 talks about Nebuchadnezzar, and then Belshazzar gets thrown in there. He shows up in Daniel 5 as well, but Belshazzar, Darius the Mede, and Cyrus finally. So this view says Daniel 7 to 12 is sort of illustrating, picking its way through the elements, the prophetic elements of the second chapter. Without regard to that necessarily, the key idea here is that the kingdom begins in the days of Cyrus, and eventually the idea here gets revisited during the time of Christ. And we don't really need to pay too much attention to all this. I just want you to know that there are other views. Let's look at Revelation, though. I do want to focus a little bit on this. This is a little bit more important than the other slides. I want you to notice a few things. We have the 4 kingdoms here in Daniel 2. We've got the 4 items here in Daniel 7. If you look at Revelation 13, there are 4 beasts which you find in Daniel 7. 4 beasts in 1. Okay, think about that. We have Revelation 13. This is going to be the chapter where we're introduced to the beast. But the beast actually is going to be an amalgamation of elements of both chapter 2 and chapter 7. Mainly chapter 7 in Daniel. So you have one beast in Revelation 13, but we've got that one beast actually is the 4, sort of the elements of the 4 combined. the beast comes, lo and behold, out of the sea. Again, that's telegraphing. The beast has 10 horns, which also comes from Daniel 7. The beast has 7 heads, and if you go back to Daniel 7 and count the number of heads on the 4 beasts, they add up to 7. Again, John is repurposing the content of Daniel 7. Revelation 13:5, we have a reference to 42 months, 3.5 years. He makes war on the holy ones. The second beast would be the little horn of Daniel. Remember, after Revelation 13, we get the second beast. We get the first beast out of the sea, then we get a second beast. And practically everybody agrees that that is the little horn of Daniel 7. We have 144,000. Again, what follows Daniel 7? We have a Jewish kingdom. So here it's followed by 144,000 sealed. Lots of judgments. Babylon riding the beast. Why is Babylon associated with the beast? Well, because that's where all this happens. Again, it's a connection point. It's not new. It's not random. It's not disconnected from the Old Testament. Because Babylon is the power that took the people of God under control, took them into exile, and eventually they're delivered. Mm-hmm. Babylon eventually falls, and you have the marriage supper of the Lamb and Armageddon. So I want you to see that Revelation 13 repurposes a lot of content from Daniel 7. And then as you read through the rest of Daniel, you're going to see a Jewish kingdom develop. You're going to read about judgments. You're going to see the fall of Babylon. And in Daniel 12, you're going to get much vaguer language about, the kingdom of God starting, the resurrection, and all this kind of stuff. So there are some new ideas, new elements, but it's repurposing Daniel 7 a lot. A couple observations here. Revelation is written in the late 90s. After 70 AD, Babylon is used by Jewish writers for Rome exclusively. In other words, outside the New Testament, Jewish writers will use the word Babylon to refer to Rome. You never see that prior to 70 AD. In all the literature in the ancient world, you never see it. Why would they do that? Well, it's based on the analogous destructions. If you're writing in 90, you just saw the Romans destroy Jerusalem. That reminds you of something. Babylon. Because that's what they did. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. So there's an immediate association there. Some people, assume that Babylon in Revelation is referring to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is referred to in the Old Testament as a whore or harlot because of her idolatry. Okay, idolatry is consistently portrayed in terms of sexual infidelity. It becomes a metaphor for idolatry. But Jews don't do that. I mean, you don't have this association before or after 70 AD. So the only place you really have it is the Old Testament. So to say that Revelation is pointing to the apostasy of Jerusalem, probably not a workable view. Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Eusebius, these are all, again, early Christian writers and leaders, all think Revelation was written in the 90s, and we're going to talk about 666 later, as far as what their views might be. I am going to pick up on some things Irenaeus says, so I'll wait till we get to that point. Summary. What do we want to get out of this one? Pre-Jesus Jews saw the kingdom of God made without hands as them. That's logical. Saw it as their race, their people, that it would and they would never go away. That's pre-Jesus Jews. They're thinking, we were brought back to the land. Yeah, we deserved it. We deserved the exile. No question about it. But God brought us back. We're in the land. and we're always going to be in the land. This was their hope. We're always going to be in the land, and someday the king, the real king, the son of David, is going to come. And then it's payback time. Then it's time, it's our time at that point. So this was their hope. This is what they believed. So they were looking for the son of David. They were looking for this, final king, who would rule over them and get rid of their oppression and all this other stuff. They believed that that kingdom would eventually inherit the earth. The king would show up. The kingdom of God would come back, and they would fulfill their mission of being a kingdom of priests to all the nations, the stuff that Isaiah and other prophets wrote about the other nations awakening, acknowledging Yahweh, acknowledging them as the kingdom of God, acknowledging the kingship of David. All this stuff Isaiah talks about in the second half of the book of Isaiah. They believed that that would happen. They were waiting for that. But the key event, again, was being brought back and then the arrival of the king. So when Jesus shows up and starts proclaiming the kingdom of God is at hand, but he actually doesn't have this in mind, again, you can see why, on one hand, people get excited, and then even if you're the disciples, like I said, when even after the resurrection, oh, this is the time, here we go. And Jesus is like, well, you're thinking too small. They're not denying, that this is going to become global, but they're still thinking politically. They're still thinking only in terms of an earthly rule. So I would suggest that when we think about prophecy, we should not think only in terms of an earthly rule. We should include that, but we're thinking too small. We're thinking too small. We're not thinking cosmically. Oh, well, I want something literal. I want to be able to go visit Jesus, and you'll be able to do that, but when the time comes. Okay? But don't presume that what Jesus actually did start, what he did tell them before he ascended, don't assume that that's less real than the thing you're envisioning, the end of the book of Revelation. That's just as real, and it's global, it's inexorable, it's unstoppable. It's all these things Jesus said it was. Okay? But again, we tend to think like pre-Jesus Jews. We tend to only think of, the terra firma here in a particular place and all. And Jesus is saying, you're just thinking too small. You're thinking too small. And the catalyst, of course, is the death and resurrection. Now, post-resurrection Christians, they understood. Again, and you may not buy this now, but we're going to go through some New Testament passages that talk about the kingdom. They understood that they were the kingdom inaugurated on earth. We are what, we don't maybe not understand all of it, but we know that when Jesus came here, that was the point when this thing we think of as the kingdom of God began anew. And when he left, the Spirit came, that was more of it, and it just started this whole expansion. We know we're in the kingdom somehow, because the Old Testament told us that it was during this fourth kingdom, this last kingdom, either, again, you can tell by me including this here, I'm looking at Rome as the fourth kingdom. We can tell that there would be some time, in real time, when this would start. Jesus preached it, and he gave us a foretaste of it. His ministry certainly showed that this was happening. The apostles preached it. There's the Great Commission. New Testament writers wrote in those terms. We'll take a look at Galatians 3. Colossians 1:13 I'll just mention now. Paul says point blank, speaking to believers, that Christ, God specifically in that passage, has translated us, has transported us, has inserted us, however you want to translate it, into the kingdom of his dear Son.
Where's that?
Colossians 1:13. If the kingdom isn't here, then there's nothing to put us into. It must be here. Now the real question is, and this sounds denigrating, but is that all there is? I mean, if that was all there is, that's great. It's a great thing. It's just as real as what we might be envisioning for the future. But that becomes the real interpretive question. Is this kingdom that is here now, will that just sort of someday morph into the eternal state? Jesus will come back and then we have this new heaven and new earth thing going on? Or will Jesus return and then we get this more traditional dispensational idea of a 1,000-year reign, after which things blow apart again, and then, that sort of thing. So what does the final form look like? What does the consummation, what does the end point look like? That's the real question. I don't see how you can read through the New Testament and read something like Colossians 1:13, read what Jesus is saying about the kingdom, and a whole host of other passages. I don't know how you can read the New Testament and not embrace the idea that the kingdom is here in some regard. It's here. Now, if you can sort of get over that hump, that means that all the power, all the deliverance, all the ministry, all the tasks, all the dominion displacement of cosmic evil that is associated with the kingdom should be going on now. And not only should be, but it can be going on now. Because that's just part of the picture. There's no passage that says, well, the kingdom's here, but this kicking out the demon stuff, we're going to put that as, just forget about that for now. That'll come later. It doesn't say that. Why are all those things associated with Jesus sending out the disciples, empowering them, telling them, you're going to do just things just like I'm doing here? Because evil, cosmic evil, needs to be kicked out. It needs to be displaced. The council needs to be reconstituted. The nations need to be reclaimed. The whole Genesis 6 thing needs reversing. All these things are in play. They don't get shelved until sometime whenever. They are all tied up with the kingdom, which in turn was inaugurated when Jesus showed up here. Okay? And particularly the crucifixion. The kingdom, Christ begins that before his crucifixion because he's doing lots of kingdom things. He's talking about the kingdom and all that. But the crucifixion is the key event. And then after that, Pentecost, and then the whole ball starts rolling. So I think you really miss out if your view of the kingdom is restricted, let's put it this way, is restricted to only a future millennium. I mean, I don't know what you're really thinking in terms of having, where does your power come from? I mean, power over the powers of darkness and stuff like that. If Jesus isn't reigning, Jesus is either reigning or he ain't. I mean, all these New Testament passages that Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, and he, rose with power, and now he rules this and that, and quoting all these rulership passages from the Old Testament and that sort of thing. That's either happening or it isn't. And I would suggest to you, if the New Testament says it's happening, we probably ought to let it say that. It sounds kind of odd to put it that way, but so what about us? The preterists again will say, this is what there is. Preterists are people who would say that, some would say all, but they would say most of prophecy, Old and New Testament, is already fulfilled. A full preterist even believes that the Lord has already returned, and they would associate that with Pentecost. But, short of that, a lot of Christians are in this camp, and they're not expecting anything to happen on earth. We're the kingdom now. This is all there is. Someday Jesus will come back, and then that initiates the eternal state, wherever that is. I think that's a little narrow. I think the alternative is a little narrow too, just narrow in a different way. These questions here we're going to consider in future installments here. There are some things connected, though, to this idea of kingdom expansion and displacement of cosmic powers and reclaiming the nations and all this stuff. There's this thing called the fullness of the Gentiles. Paul, I'm going to show you why I believe, and it's certainly not a stretch, I think it's pretty clear, that Paul believed his lifetime was supposed to fulfill the fullness of the Gentiles. That is, the gospel had to be taken to every known nation at the time, specifically because the Babel event had to be reversed. The gospel has to be planted in every known nation at the time, so the nations can be reclaimed. And Paul looked at himself as the person that God had chosen to do that. So that when Paul has these throwaway statements, like he's in jail, he's sitting in jail, and he goes, I need to go to Spain. I need to get to Spain. I think he really believed, I'm not going to die until I get to Spain. Because Isaiah 66 says, I have to get to Tarshish. I mean, the Tarshish was the outer point of the known world. Tarshish is mentioned in the Table of Nations. I mean, all these little connections, that Paul's thinking, I'm not done until I get to the end. Then I can die. Then it's mission accomplished. So I think he really believed that I'll be okay. Life's pretty hard. I get beat up a lot. I go into every town. I ask, where's the synagogue and where's the jail? I'm going to start in one and end up in the other. It's rough, but I'm going to make it to the end of the world, the end of the known world, because that's the mission. There are just little things like that in the New Testament. We now know that there's lots of nations beyond Spain, beyond Gibraltar. So the question is, did this really happen in Paul's lifetime? Well, no. So how do we know when the fullness of Gentiles is accomplished? There are little questions like that.